Hello and welcome to my presentation, which will go over a qualitative analysis that I conducted of the portrayal of corporate crime in a true crime podcast. So the presentation will consist of three main sections, being a literature review, an analysis of the podcast Swindled, the true crime podcast that I've analyzed, and a section that outlines my results and discussion. So, outlined here are a few of the themes in the literature on news media depictions of corporate crime. So, an overarching theme in the literature is that news media outlets are reluctant and they just simply don't refer to corporate deviancy as crime. They refer to it as other things, such as an accident, and they frame it as if it is an accident, which makes it seem like no crime has taken place. Further, the news media tends to focus on the consequences over the causes of corporate crime. So, like victimization, and also considers the ways in which the corporation has been a victim of its own crime. And this is problematic, the fact that they focus on the consequence over the causes of corporate crime, in that neglecting cause also means neglecting the role the corporation played in perpetrating the crime. And the news media doesn't just neglect the role that the corporation played in committing the crime, but they also conceal the role that the corporation played by deflecting blame onto other individuals, such as regulators or governments, and not directly considering the role that the corporation played. Finally, when the corporation is identified as having perpetrated the crime and is established as morally blameworthy, the crime is presented as wrongdoing, the wrongdoing of a few corrupt officials rather than a systemic issue. And these are all the ways that corporate crime is distorted in the news media. Now, the news media can be recognized as a hegemonic device in that it disproportionately reports on crimes of the powerless relative to the crimes of the powerful. And this is despite the fact that the crimes of the latter group are far more pervasive and pose greater societal consequences than those of the former. Crimes of the powerless, then, things like assault, robbery, gang-related activities, etc., which are overrepresented as perpetrated by racial and ethnic minorities, becomes the common sense conception of what constitutes crime and who constitutes criminals. The media's omission of corporate criminality and corporate criminals in its accounts of crime legitimates the corporation as an entity that can only do good, justifying its incessant power and wealth. On the other hand, rampant media depictions of the crimes of the powerless subject these groups to punitive attitudes and policing. Horn 2023, which has conducted the latest work in the area of corporate crime media portrayals, suggests that scholars in this field investigate contemporary forms of media. And for this, for my study, I chose the podcast. I have chosen the podcast as the form of media to investigate because they have demonstrated the ability to offer more holistic perspectives on crime and challenge sensationalist reporting practices that are seen in the media. The advantage that podcasts have in challenging hegemonic portrayals of corporate crime relative to the news media lies in that podcasts that are independently run are not constrained by the expectations of corporate owners and advertisers, which is identified as one of the reasons that the media distorts corporate criminality. Another advantage is that podcasts are lengthier and more and offer more descriptive accounts of crime, including a wider range of perspectives and narratives than the media can offer in a single article. So, the podcast that I have selected to sample from is the Swindled True Crime podcast. I've selected one episode from the podcast that covers the Bhopal massacre. Now, I've selected Swindled as the podcast to sample from because it is independently run by an individual who goes by the alias Concerned Citizen. The fact that the podcast is independently run is key in that it doesn't face the same corporate constraints and pressures as the news media. Additionally, the podcast's mission is to expose corporate greed, and it has covered over 100 cases of white-collar and corporate crime. The research question then is, can Swindled challenge the hegemonic portrayal of corporate crime? And my hypothesis is that it can. So, the theoretical standpoint of my research is constructionist in that the underlying assumption is that the truth about crime is socially constructed, and that is by the media, among other institutions. And that I'm interested in how a podcast can challenge prevailing constructions of truth in constructing an alternative truth. So, my analysis process involved listening to the podcast episode on the Bhopal tragedy, listened to it a few times at first, and then extracted key elements according to the themes of perpetrator, cause of crime, victimization, and punishment. So, looking at instances where the podcast discusses these elements and looking at how it frames information as it relates to who is the perpetrator, what was the cause of crime, who were victims, and what punishment ensued. And here is a little snippet of my analysis, and I've chosen the theme of perpetrator to discuss. So for each theme, I have grouped narratives according to whether they constitute dominant or counter frames. Dominant frames are the narratives employed by the powerful in making sense of or framing the incident. Narratives that have traditionally shaped news media discourse and framing incidents. in a way that benefits the corporation, allows it to uphold, in a way that upholds its power. Counterframes are narratives that challenge dominant frames and work to reconstruct the corporate crime, a corporate crime reality, framing the incident in a manner that is more reflective of the true nature of corporate crime. The dominant frames here, as it pertains to the theme of perpetrator, are offered by Union Carbide. They blame local management at the plant at Bhopal. They've blamed Sikh terrorists, and they've also blamed an employee at the plant for the crime. Counterframes are offered by Concerned Citizen, the host of the Swindled podcast, in this episode. And what's important is that the podcast begins by establishing Union Carbide's liability and responsibility for the incident, in the own words of Concerned Citizen. So listeners can interpret dominant frames relative to the counter frame offered at the beginning of the podcast episode. Another key finding is that Concerned Citizen frames the CEO of Union Carbide, Warren Anderson, as the perpetrator of the crime. However, this is done indirectly. Concerned Citizen doesn't directly state that Warren Anderson is a criminal, but however, he conveys this by focusing on how Anderson has evaded prosecution. Overall, I find that the podcast did a pretty good job of establishing Union Carbide and Warren Anderson as the perpetrators, and that it doesn't follow the news media's footsteps in giving priority to dominant narratives that frame other parties and not the corporation itself as responsible for the crime. So the key limitation of my research is that it is not generalizable, meaning that just because Swindled Podcast was capable of offering counter-hegemonic narratives or frames of corporate crime, this may not be reflective of all true crime podcasts. The strength of my research lies in that it forms the ground for the idea that a independently run podcast, a decentralized form of media, holds the ability to challenge hegemonic accounts of corporate criminality. To address the limitation, not fully, but to a certain extent, future research would involve carrying this project out on a larger scale and analyzing multiple popular true crime podcasts reporting on a case of corporate crime. Thank you for listening, and provide any questions, comments that you have below.